The first story. The last raid. The sea stretched endlessly before the longship, its surface a shimmering mirror of silver and gray, kissed by the soft breath of a northern wind. The seasoned Viking warrior stood at the prow, his calloused hands resting lightly on the weathered wood. His gray-streaked beard fluttered gently as the salt air wove through it, and his eyes, pale as the frost that clung to the fjords in winter, gazed out at the horizon. This was his final raid. He knew it in his bones, in the ache of his joints, in the quiet certainty that settled over him like a blanket of snow. The ship rocked steadily beneath his feet, its oars slicing through the water with a rhythm as old as the tides. Behind him, the younger warriors prepared their gear, sharpening blades, tightening leather straps, their movements quick and eager. Their faces glowed with the fire of youth, their laughter swallowed by the wind. The warrior watched them, his expression unchanging, like a stone carved by years of storm and sun. He did not join their restless energy. Instead, he let his mind drift, carried back across the decades like a raven soaring over the vastness of Midgard. He remembered his first raid so many summers ago. The air had smelled of pine and smoke then, the shore of a distant land rising green and unfamiliar before his youthful eyes. His hands had trembled as he gripped his axe, not from fear, but from the wild thrill of what lay ahead. The clash of steel, the cries of the fallen, the rush of blood through his veins, it had been a song then, a hymn to the gods who watched from their golden halls. He had returned home that year with spoils and scars, his name whispered with respect around the fire. Now, the longship creaked as it neared the foreign coast, its timbers groaning like the joints of an old friend. The warrior's gaze shifted to the sky, where clouds drifted lazily, their edges tinged with the faint gold of a sun that hung low and tired. He wondered if the All-Father Odin watched him now, one-eyed and inscrutable, perched upon his throne in Asgard. Did the god of war still see the flame in him, or had it dimmed to embers beneath the weight of time? The shore came into view, a jagged line of cliffs and trees bathed in the soft haze of morning. The younger men leapt to their feet, shields clattering as they readied themselves. The warrior remained still, his axe resting against his side, its blade notched from countless battles. He felt no hurry now, no need to prove himself. His steps were measured as he joined them, his boots sinking into the wet sand as the ship scraped against the shallows. The raid began as it always had, with a surge of bodies and the thunder of feet against the earth. The village they struck was small, nestled between the cliffs like a child cradled in its mother's arms. Smoke rose in thin tendrils as the first fires caught, and the air filled with the scent of burning thatch and pine. The warrior moved through it all like a shadow, his strikes deliberate and precise, born of habit rather than passion. He felled a man with a single blow, the motion as natural as breathing, and stepped over the body without a glance. Around him, the younger warriors roared their triumph, their blades flashing in the sunlight, their shields painted with the blood of their foes. He found a quiet space amid the chaos, a patch of grass untouched by the fray, and lowered himself to sit. His chest rose and fell slowly, the weight of his armor pressing against his shoulders. From here he watched the raid unfold, the dance of steel and fire, the fleeting shapes of men locked in struggle. It was beautiful in its way, like a storm rolling across the sea. He let his mind wander again, back to the faces of those he had fought beside over the years. Bjorn, with his booming laugh, lost to a spear in a raid across the eastern waters. Astrid, fierce and unyielding, who had fallen beneath a Saxon shield wall. They were gone now, their bones resting in the earth or scattered across the waves. The wind brushed his face, carrying the distant cry of a gull. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes for a moment, and pictured Valhalla. He saw its golden roof gleaming beneath an endless sky, heard the clatter of feasting warriors, their voices raised in song. Would they welcome him there, those who had gone before? Would the Valkyries sweep down on their winged steeds to carry him to that eternal hall? Or would he wander forever in the mists, a shade forgotten by the gods? The raid was winding down now. The younger men gathered their spoils, sacks of grain, silver trinkets, a few bleeding goats, while the flames flickered and died among the ruins. The warrior rose, his knees protesting faintly, and walked toward the shore. The sea lapped at his boots, cool and gentle, as if inviting him to rest. He lifted his axe one last time, running his fingers along its edge, feeling the stories etched into its steel. Then he set it down in the sand, an offering to the waves, to the gods, to the life he had lived. The longship waited, its prow cutting a sharp silhouette against the water. The others clambered aboard, their voices softer now, weary from the day's work. The warrior followed, settling at the stern this time, his back to the land they left behind. The oars dipped once more, pulling them away from the shore, and the village faded into a smudge of smoke and memory. He leaned back, letting the motion of the ship cradle him, the steady rhythm lulling his thoughts. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. The warrior's eyes traced the clouds, searching for a sign, a raven's wing, a spear of light, but the heavens remained quiet. And yet there was peace in that silence. He had fought his battles, sailed his seas, left his mark upon the world. If this was to be his end, he would meet it as he had lived, steady, unbowed, ready to face whatever awaited. The ship sailed on, cutting through the waves toward home, or perhaps toward something greater. The warrior closed his eyes, the sound of the water filling his ears, and let the wind carry him wherever it would. The gods would decide his fate as they always had. For now he rested, a man of war adrift in the calm of his final journey. The second story. The Silent Village. The longship glided through the mist, its oars dipping into the dark water with a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. The Viking warband sat in silence, their breath visible in the cool dawn air, their hands resting on axes and shields. The sea was a vast, glassy expanse, unbroken save for the ripples trailing behind them. At the helm stood their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a mane of silver-threaded hair, his eyes narrowed as the faint outline of land emerged from the fog. They had sailed for days, guided by tales of a remote village ripe for plunder, its people said to guard treasures of silver and amber. The shore came into view, a rugged stretch of pebbles and driftwood framed by cliffs that loomed like sleeping giants. The warband disembarked, their boots crunching softly against the stones, their movements practiced and unhurried. The air carried the scent of salt and damp earth, and a faint breeze stirred the warrior's cloak as he led them inland. The village lay just beyond a rise, nestled in a hollow where the trees grew sparse and twisted, their branches reaching like skeletal hands toward the gray sky. As they crested the hill, the warriors paused, their eyes sweeping over the cluster of houses below. The thatched roofs sagged under the weight of time, and smoke should have curled from chimneys, but there was none. No voices drifted on the wind, no clatter of daily life greeted them. The village was still, wrapped in a silence so deep it seemed to press against their ears. The leader raised a hand, signaling the warband to spread out, and they descended into the hollow, their steps muffled by the mossy ground. The first house they approached was small, its door ajar, swaying faintly as if caught by a ghost's breath. A warrior pushed it open with the tip of his axe, revealing a room frozen in time. A wooden table stood in the center, a loaf of bread resting upon it, its crust dusted with a thin layer of mold. A clay cup sat nearby, half filled with water that had grown still and cloudy. The hearth was cold, its ashes undisturbed, as if no fire had burned there for weeks. The warrior stepped back, his brow creasing slightly, and moved on to the next dwelling. House after house told the same tale. Blankets lay neatly folded on beds, tools hung on walls, a child's wooden toy, a carved horse, sat abandoned in a corner. The warband moved through the streets, their shadows stretching long and thin in the pale light. A loom stood in one home, its threads taut and unfinished, as if the weaver had simply risen and walked away mid-task. A basket of fish, their scales dulled by time, rested by a doorway, the faint stench of rot mingling with the damp air. Yet there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken doors, no bodies sprawled in the dirt. The leader wandered to the edge of the village, where a well sat encircled by stones. He leaned over its rim, peering into the blackness below. The water lay far down, a mirror of inky stillness, reflecting nothing but the void. A faint chill brushed his neck, not from the wind but from something deeper, something that stirred in the quiet. He straightened, his gaze drifting to the forest beyond. The trees stood like sentinels, their trunks shrouded in mist, their branches swaying ever so slightly though the air felt still. One of the younger warriors ventured toward a barn at the village's edge. Its doors creaked as he nudged them open, revealing a cavernous space lit only by slivers of light piercing the slatted walls. Hay lay scattered across the floor, and a pitchfork leaned against a stall, its tines gleaming faintly. In the center of the barn, a circle of stones caught his eye, small, smooth pebbles arranged with care, as if placed by deliberate hands. At its heart lay a single feather, black as a raven's wing, its edges frayed. The warrior knelt, his fingers hovering over it, but he did not touch it. A shiver rippled through him, and he retreated to the others. The warband gathered in the village square, their faces etched with unease. The leader stood among them, his presence a steady anchor, though his own mind churned with questions. He walked to the longhouse at the village's heart, its roof adorned with carved runes weathered by rain and wind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something sharper, like iron left to rust. A great table stretched the length of the room, its surface bare save for a single object, an amulet of twisted bronze, its center inlaid with a polished stone that gleamed like an unblinking eye. He lifted it, the metal cool against his skin, and felt a faint hum as if it pulsed with a life of its own. The runes along its edge were unfamiliar, their shapes jagged and strange, unlike the ones he knew from home. He set it down gently, his thoughts drifting to the tales of old stories of spirits that lured men into the mists, of villages swallowed by the wrath of unseen gods. The silence pressed heavier now, a weight that seemed to seep into his bones. The warriors began to retreat, their steps slow, their eyes darting to the shadows that clung to the houses. They took nothing, no silver, no amber, no spoils of war. The village offered no riches, only questions that hung in the air like the mist that thickened around them. The leader lingered a moment longer, standing at the threshold of the longhouse, his gaze sweeping the empty streets. The feather in the barn, the amulet on the table, the untouched bread, they wove a mystery he could not unravel, a chill that settled deep in his chest. The warband returned to the shore, the pebbles shifting beneath their feet as they climbed aboard the longship. The oars took up their rhythm once more, pulling them away from the silent village, its outline fading into the fog. The leader stood at the stern, watching as the cliffs receded, their jagged forms swallowed by the haze. The sea stretched before them, vast and untroubled, its surface a mirror of the sky above. No one spoke as the ship sailed on, the only sound the gentle slap of water against the hull. The warriors sat with their shields at their sides, their faces turned inward, lost in thoughts they could not name. The leader rested a hand on the rail, the amulet's strange hum lingering in his mind, a whisper from a world beyond his own. The village remained behind them, a riddle carved into the earth, its silence unbroken, its secrets kept by the mist and the trees. The wind rose softly, carrying the scent of salt and distant storms, and the longship drifted onward, cradled by the sea's endless embrace. Whatever had befallen the village, it was not theirs to understand. They left it as they had found it, quiet, empty, waiting in the stillness for someone or something to return. The third story. The sea wolves. The longship sliced through the waves, its dragon-headed prow rising and falling with the rhythm of the sea. Known as Fenrir's Fong, it was a vessel of legend, its name whispered in fear along the coasts of distant lands. The Vikings aboard were sea wolves, their eyes sharp as blades, their hands weathered by years of raids. The sails billowed in the wind, dyed red like the blood of their enemies, and the oars dipped in unison, pulling them deeper into the gray expanse. They were bound for enemy territory, a daring raid planned under a sky streaked with the first hints of dusk. The fleet stretched behind them, 5 ships in all, their hulls cutting through the water like a pack of wolves on the hunt. The leader of Fenrir's Fong stood at the helm, his cloak snapping in the breeze, his silver hair catching the fading light. His axe rested at his side, its edge honed to a whisper of death. The warriors around him moved with quiet purpose, securing ropes, checking shields, their movements as natural as the tide. The air smelled of salt and storm, and the sea murmured beneath them, a lullaby for men born to its embrace. Night fell softly, the stars piercing the velvet sky like the tips of spears. The fleet sailed on, the ship's shadowy silhouettes against the water's gleam. The leader's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the enemy coast lay unseen, a promise of fire and plunder. The sea wolves were ready, their hearts steady, their instincts honed by countless voyages. The wind carried a faint chill, brushing their faces as they leaned into the journey, the longship rocking gently beneath their feet. Then the storm came. It crept over the sea like a shadow, its clouds thick and roiling, swallowing the stars one by one. The wind turned sharp, clawing at the sails, and the waves rose, their crests tipped with foam. The leader gripped the helm, his knuckles whitening as the ship shuddered. The fleet scattered, the other longships vanishing into the dark as rain lashed down, cold and relentless. The sea wolves braced themselves, their boots slipping on the wet deck, their shields raised against the fury of the sky. The storm raged for hours, a dance of wind and water that tossed Fenrir's Fong like a leaf on a river. The warriors clung to the ropes, their bodies swaying with the ship, their faces carved from stone. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating the chaos, the oars splintered, the sails torn, the sea a churning abyss. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm retreated, leaving the longship adrift under a sky heavy with silence. The fleet was gone, the horizon empty save for the faint shimmer of dawn. The warriors took stock, their hands moving slowly now, repairing what they could. The leader stood at the prow, his eyes scanning the water, searching for a sign of their kin. The sea stretched vast and unbroken, its surface smoothing into a mirror of pale light. A stillness settled over them, the kind that follows a tempest, and the ship drifted on, carried by the current's gentle pull. The air grew warm, the scent of salt mingling with something sharper, something alive. It rose from the depths without warning, a serpent, its scales glinting like wet iron, its body coiling through the waves. Its eyes glowed amber, unblinking, and its jaws parted to reveal fangs long as swords. The sea wolves froze, their breath catching as the creature circled the ship, its tail flicking the water into froth. The leader reached for his axe, his movements calm, deliberate, as if greeting an old foe. The warriors followed, their weapons gleaming in the morning light, their instincts flaring like embers. The serpent struck, its head lunging toward the deck, and the sea wolves met it with steel. Axes bit into its flesh, sending sprays of dark blood across the ship. The creature thrashed, its coils slamming against the hull, but the warriors held their ground, their strikes swift and sure. The leader drove his blade into its eye, the amber light dimming as the serpent sank back into the sea, its body slipping beneath the waves. The ship rocked gently in its wake, the water stained red, then clear once more. The warriors stood panting, their faces streaked with salt and blood, but the calm returned, the sea settling into a quiet embrace. They cleaned their weapons, their hands steady, and turned their eyes to the horizon. The leader gazed out, his chest rising and falling slowly, the weight of survival settling over him like a cloak. The ship drifted on, its timbers creaking softly, a survivor of storm and beast. But the trials were not over. From the mist came the shapes of enemy ships, 3 of them, their sails black against the pale sky, their prows cutting through the water with purpose. The sea wolves straightened, their weariness fading, their brutal instincts rising once more. The leader pointed to the horizon, his hand steady, and the warriors moved as one, raising shields, gripping axes, their bodies a wall of resolve. The enemy closed in, their ships circling like hounds around a wounded stag. Arrows rained down, thudding into the deck, but the sea wolves crouched low, their shields a canopy of wood and iron. The first ship rammed Fenrir's Fong, its hull grinding against theirs, and the warriors leapt into action. They swung over the side, their boots finding purchase on the enemy deck, their blades flashing in the dim light. The clash was swift and silent, a dance of steel and shadow, the sea wolves tearing through their foes with the precision of a pack. The second ship fell as quickly, its crew overwhelmed by the ferocity of men tempered by storm and serpent. The third turned to flee, its sails catching the wind, but the sea wolves pursued, their longships surging forward. They boarded it under a sky now streaked with gold, their axes carving a path through the enemy ranks until the deck was theirs. The ship rocked beneath them, its spoils, sacks of grain, barrels of mead, claimed in quiet triumph. The sea wolves returned to Fenrir's Fong, their bodies weary but unbroken, their spirits forged anew. The leader stood at the helm once more, his gaze fixed on the sea ahead. The enemy ships drifted behind them, empty husks swallowed by the waves, and the mist began to lift, revealing a coastline in the distance. The ship sailed on, its prow cutting through the water, the rhythm of the oars a soothing pulse. The sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the deck, and the warriors rested, their shields at their sides, their faces turned to the light. The sea stretched endless before them, a vast cradle rocking them gently, its whispers a promise of home, or perhaps another raid. The leader closed his eyes, the wind brushing his hair, and let the ship carry them forward, a pack of wolves adrift in the calm after the storm. The fourth story. The burning monastery. The longship drifted toward the rocky shore, its oars cutting through the water with a rhythm as soft as a lullaby. The Vikings aboard were a seasoned band, their hands rough from years of gripping axes, their eyes glinting with the promise of plunder. The sails hung slack in the still air, dyed a deep crimson that glowed faintly in the twilight. Their target loomed ahead, a monastery perched on a cliff, its stone walls weathered by the sea's breath, its spire piercing the sky like a silent sentinel. Tales of a great treasure hidden within its halls had drawn them here, a prize whispered to be worth more than gold. The ship scraped against the pebbled beach and the warriors disembarked, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The air carried the scent of salt and moss, and a faint mist curled around their legs as they climbed the winding path to the monastery. The leader, a man with a beard streaked with gray, led the way, his axe resting lightly on his shoulder. The others followed, their shields clattering softly, their steps steady and unhurried. The sky above was a tapestry of deep blues and purples, the last light of day slipping away as they reached the wooden gates. The monastery stood silent, its windows dark, its walls stained with lichen. The Vikings pushed through the gates, the hinges groaning under the weight of years. Inside, the air was cool and heavy, thick with the scent of old wax and parchment. The hall stretched before them, lined with benches and a stone altar at its far end. Candles lay toppled, their wicks long extinguished, and shadows danced across the walls as the warriors moved deeper. They spread out, their hands tracing the edges of shelves, lifting tapestries, searching for the treasure that had lured them across the sea. In a chamber beneath the altar, they found it, a relic encased in a wooden box, its lid carved with runes that twisted like serpents. The leader pried it open, revealing a chalice of blackened silver, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shift in the torchlight. A single gem, red as blood, gleamed at its center, pulsing faintly as if alive. The warriors gathered around, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, their breaths shallow. They took the chalice, wrapping it in cloth, and set the monastery ablaze as they left, the fire licking at the walls, sending plumes of smoke into the night sky. The longship sailed away, the burning monastery a fading glow on the horizon. The sea rocked them gently, its waves lapping against the hull, and the warriors settled into their places, the chalice stowed beneath a bench. The stars emerged, bright and cold, and the wind whispered through the rigging, a soft song that carried them into the night. At first all seemed well, the raid had been swift, the prize secured, the journey home begun. But then the misfortunes crept in, slow and insidious, like fog rolling over the water. One warrior fell ill, his skin paling, his hands trembling as he clutched his shield. He sat apart, his breath shallow, his eyes darting to the shadows as if something watched from beyond the ship. Another wandered too close to the edge during a calm night, his foot slipping on the wet deck, and the sea swallowed him without a sound. The crew watched the waves close over him, their faces tightening, their hands lingering on their weapons. The chalice seemed to hum, a faint vibration felt through the wood where it rested. The leader noticed it first, his fingers brushing the cloth, a chill seeping into his bones. He unwrapped it once, late under a moonless sky, and saw the gem's glow had deepened, its red light spilling across his hands like spilled wine. He covered it again, his movements slow, but the unease had taken root. The warriors began to change, their usual steadiness unraveling like a frayed rope. One man, once steady as stone, grew restless, his hands twitching as he sharpened his axe, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if expecting an enemy that never came. Another turned quiet, his gaze hollow, staring at the chalice's hiding place for hours, his fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. A third fell sick, his cough echoing across the deck, his strength fading until he could no longer lift his shield. The sea wolves, once a united pack, began to drift apart, their shadows stretching long and strange in the torchlight. The sea itself seemed to turn against them. A fog settled over the ship, thick and gray, muffling the sound of the waves. The stars vanished and the wind died, leaving the longship adrift in a world of stillness. The leader stood at the helm, his hands gripping the wood, his eyes straining to pierce the mist. The oars moved sluggishly, the warriors' strength waning, their rhythm faltering. A man vanished into the fog one night, his place empty by morning, his shield left behind as if he had simply stepped into the void. Suspicion grew like a weed among them. The warriors cast sidelong glances, their hands hovering near their axes, their shoulders tense. The sick man's cough became a warning, his presence avoided as if he carried a plague. The restless one paced the deck, his shadow looming over the others, his movements sharp and unpredictable. The leader watched it all, his chest heavy, the chalice's hum a constant murmur in his mind. He wondered if the monks had known, if the treasure was no prize at all, but a curse woven into silver and stone. The misfortunes piled higher. A storm rose, gentler than most, but enough to snap an oar and tear a hole in the sail. Fish refused their nets, leaving the crew hungry, their faces gaunt in the dim light. The fog lingered, days blending into nights, the ship trapped in a timeless drift. The leader unwrapped the chalice again, its gem now a deep crimson, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. He held it over the side, his arm steady, but something stayed his hand, a whisper of doubt, a flicker of greed, a fear of what might follow if he let it go. The warriors grew fewer. One fell overboard during a quiet swell, his body vanishing beneath the waves. Another simply lay down one night, his breath slowing until it stopped, his eyes open to the sky. The rest moved like shadows, their faces carved with suspicion, their hands never far from steel. The leader stood apart, the chalice at his side, its weight a burden he could not shed. The sea rocked them onward, its rhythm unbroken, its surface a mirror of their unraveling. At last the fog lifted, revealing a distant shore, home, or so it seemed. The longship drifted toward it, the warriors too weary to cheer, their numbers dwindled to a handful. The leader guided them in, the chalice still wrapped, its hum a faint echo in the stillness. They beached the ship, their boots sinking into familiar sand, but the air felt wrong, too quiet, too heavy. The warriors scattered, some stumbling into the trees, others collapsing by the water, their bodies spent. The leader stood alone, the chalice in his hands, its gem glowing through the cloth. He walked to the sea's edge, the waves lapping at his feet, and let it fall. The water swallowed it, the red light fading into the depths, the hum silenced at last. He turned away, his steps slow, the monastery's fire a distant memory. The sea wolves were broken, their strength lost to a curse they could not name, but the sea remained, vast and eternal, cradling them in its endless calm. The fifth story. The young Viking's reflection. The longship rocked gently on the waves, its oars resting still as the shore came into view, a jagged line of cliffs and trees bathed in the soft glow of dawn. The young Viking stood among his kin, his hands gripping an axe still warm from the forge, his chest rising with the thrill of the raid ahead. His hair, wild and golden, fluttered in the salt-kissed breeze, and his eyes shone with the fire of youth. The warband leapt ashore, their boots crunching against the pebbles, their shields raised as they surged toward the town nestled in the valley beyond. The raid was swift and fierce, a storm of steel and flame that swept through the streets. Houses of timber and thatch crumpled under the Vikings' hands, their roofs blazing against the morning sky. The air filled with smoke and the sharp tang of blood, the ground littered with shattered pottery and scattered grain. The young Viking moved with the others, his axe swinging in wide arcs, his body alive with the rhythm of battle. The town fell quickly, its people fleeing or falling, its walls no match for the sea wolves who descended upon it. When the chaos settled, the young Viking stood amid the ruins, his breath slowing, his hands stained with soot and crimson. The town was a husk now, its market silent, its hearts cold, its once thriving pulse extinguished. He wandered through the wreckage, his steps heavy, the crackle of dying fires filling the air. Then he saw her, a survivor, a girl no older than he, crouched beside a toppled cart. Her eyes, wide and dark, met his, shimmering with tears yet burning with something deeper, grief, defiance, a quiet strength that pierced him like an arrow. He froze, his axe slipping slightly in his grip, the weight of her gaze settling into his chest. The glory he had felt moments before, the rush of conquest, the pride of victory, faded, replaced by a hollow ache. He turned away, rejoining the warband as they gathered their spoils, sacks of silver, barrels of mead, trinkets torn from the fallen. The longship sailed away, the town a smoldering memory on the horizon, but those eyes lingered in his mind, a shadow he could not shake. The sea cradled them as they returned home, its waves lapping against the hull in a steady, soothing rhythm. The young Viking sat apart, his hands idle, his gaze lost in the water's depths. The others laughed and boasted, their voices swallowed by the wind, but he remained silent, the girl's face etched into his thoughts. He wondered who she had been, a daughter, a sister, a dreamer like him, and what her life might have held before the raid tore it apart. The glory of war, once a bright flame, flickered in his heart, its warmth growing cold. Days turned to weeks, then months, and the raids continued. The longship sailed again and again, its prow cutting through the waves toward new shores. Each pillage followed the same pattern, fire and steel, screams and silence, spoils piled high. The young Viking fought as he always had, his axe a blur, his shield a wall, but the thrill had dulled. He stood over burning villages, their streets strewn with the remnants of lives, broken looms, scattered toys, a lone shoe abandoned in the mud, and felt the ache grow. In one raid he watched a fisherman's hut collapse, its roof swallowed by flames, and saw a net half-woven lying in the ashes. In another he stepped over a fallen warrior, the man's hand still clutching a carved wooden bird, its wings chipped from age. Each sight tugged at him, a thread unraveling the tapestry of honor he had once believed in. The warband celebrated their victories, their faces alight with triumph, but the young Viking lingered at the edges, his shoulders slumped, his spirit heavy. The seasons turned, the sea carrying them to distant lands, green coasts, rocky fjords, windswept plains. The raids blurred together, a cycle of destruction and return. He grew taller, his frame hardening, his hands calloused from years of war, but his eyes remained soft, haunted by the faces he could not forget. In a Saxon village, he saw a woman shielding her child as the flames closed in, her gaze echoing the girls from that first raid. In a northern settlement, he found a dog whining beside its fallen master, its loyalty unshaken by the chaos. Each moment sank deeper, a quiet tide eroding his resolve. The warband noticed his change, their glances sharp, their shoulders turning away, but he cared little. He fought beside them still, his skill unmatched, yet his heart drifted elsewhere. At night, as the longship swayed beneath a sky thick with stars, he leaned against the rail, the sea's whispers filling his ears. He pictured a life beyond the raids, a hearth of his own, fields tilled by his hands, a peace unbroken by the clash of steel. The thought warmed him, a flicker of light in the darkness, but it felt distant, a dream shadowed by the blood on his hands. One raid took them to a coastal town, its stone walls crumbling under their assault. The young Viking moved through the streets, his axe heavy, his steps slow. The fires roared, the air thick with smoke, and he found himself in a quiet corner, a garden trampled but still blooming with pale flowers. An old man sat there, his hands folded, his eyes meeting the Vikings with a calm that stopped him cold. The man did not flee or fight, simply watched, and the young Viking lowered his weapon, the ache swelling into something vast and unshakable. He turned from the garden, leaving the old man untouched, and rejoined the warband as they sailed away, their ship laden with spoils. The sea stretched before them, endless and serene, its surface a mirror of the sky's soft grays. The young Viking stood at the prow, the wind brushing his face, the girl's eyes from that first raid merging with the old man's in his mind. He wondered if there was more, if life could be built instead of broken, if his hands could create instead of destroy. The raids went on, the longship cutting through the waves, the warband's hunger for glory unquenched. The young Viking fought, his body a machine of habit, but his soul drifted further with each shore they burned. He saw beauty in the ruins, a child's laughter echoing in memory, a river winding through a ravaged valley, a bird soaring above the ashes, and felt the weight of what he had taken. The sea rocked him gently, its rhythm a balm, and he let his thoughts wander to a future he could scarcely imagine. The longship sailed home at last, its hull creaking under the weight of years and plunder. The young Viking stood on the deck, his axe at his side, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the cliffs of his homeland rose. The warband dispersed, their steps eager, but he lingered by the shore, the waves lapping at his boots. He closed his eyes, the faces of the fallen fading into the wind, and felt a quiet resolve settle over him, a whisper of a life beyond conquest, a hope carried on the sea's endless tide. The sixth story. The warrior's return. The longship glided through the fjord, its oars dipping into the still water with a rhythm as gentle as a sigh. The Viking raider stood at the prow, his cloak heavy with the salt of distant seas, his hands scarred from years of gripping steel. His beard, once fiery red, was now threaded with silver, and his eyes, weathered by storms and battles, gazed at the cliffs rising ahead. Home lay beyond those jagged walls, a village he had left behind in his youth, chasing glory across the waves. The sails fluttered faintly, the wind a soft whisper as the ship neared the shore. The beach was as he remembered it, smooth pebbles stretching to meet the water, framed by pines that swayed in the breeze. He stepped ashore, his boots sinking into the earth, the scent of resin and damp moss filling his lungs. The warband dispersed, their steps light with the promise of hearth and kin, but the raider lingered, his gaze tracing the path that wound up the hill. The village waited there, its thatched roofs peeking through the trees, smoke curling lazily into a sky painted with the soft hues of dusk. He climbed the path, his axe resting at his side, its weight a familiar companion. The village came into view, smaller than he recalled, its edges softened by time. The longhouse stood at its heart, its timbers darkened by weather, its carvings worn smooth. He paused, his chest tightening with a flicker of memory, laughter by the fire, the clatter of wooden bowls, the warmth of a life he had once known. But the air felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if the years had draped a veil over the place he had carried in his heart. The villagers moved through their tasks, their hands busy with nets and looms, their faces turned to the rhythm of peace. He approached, his shadow falling long across the dirt, and they glanced up, their eyes narrowing with recognition, then clouding with something else, distance, unease, a flicker of fear. He stood among them, his armor dented from battles, his presence a stark contrast to their simple tunics and steady hands. They turned away, their steps quickening, their shoulders hunching as if to shield themselves from the man he had become. He sought his family's home, a modest house near the river's edge. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a room lit by a low fire. His sister sat by the hearth, her hair graying, her fingers threading a needle through cloth. She looked up, her gaze meeting his, and for a moment, the past shimmered between them, days of chasing geese, nights of shared stories. But her eyes hardened, her hands stilling, and she rose, retreating to a corner as if he were a stranger clad in her brother's skin. His mother, frail and bent, watched from a chair, her face etched with sorrow, her arms unmoving as he stepped closer. The raider lingered, the fire's warmth brushing his face, but the chill within him grew. He left the house, the door closing softly behind him, and wandered the village streets. His old friends stood by the forge, their hammers striking iron, their laughter echoing as it once had. He approached, his hand raised in greeting, but their smiles faded, their eyes darting to the scars on his arms, the axe at his hip. They turned back to their work, their rhythm unbroken, leaving him a shadow on the edge of their world. The village had changed, or perhaps he had. The field stretched wider now, golden with barley, tended by hands that knew no war. Children darted through the grass, their voices a melody he could not join. The river flowed steady and clear, its banks lined with boats built for fishing, not raids. He walked its edge, the water lapping at the stones, and saw his reflection, a man forged by conquest, his edges sharp where the village had grown soft. The years of blood and fire had carved him into something that no longer fit the gentle curves of this life. He tried to reclaim his place. He sat by the fire in the longhouse, its benches filled with faces he half knew, their stories of harvests and tides washing over him like a foreign tongue. He lifted a net to mend it, his fingers fumbling with the knots, the delicate work slipping from hands trained to wield steel. He joined a hunt in the woods, his steps silent, his axe ready, but the others flinched at his swiftness, their bows trembling as he felled a stag with a single blow. Each effort pushed him further apart, a piece that no longer matched the puzzle of home. The days stretched into weeks, the air cooling as autumn painted the trees in amber and crimson. The raider wandered, his presence a quiet ripple through the village. He sat by the river, watching the water carry leaves downstream, their journey a mirror of his own, adrift, unmoored. He climbed the cliffs, the wind tugging at his cloak, and looked out at the sea, its vastness a call he could no longer answer. The glory of war, once a bright flame, had burned to ash, leaving him hollow, a man shaped by a life that no longer held meaning here. One evening, as the sky deepened to violet, he walked to the edge of the village, where the pines thickened into a forest. The villagers gathered for a feast, their voices rising in song, their fires casting a warm glow. He stood apart, the music brushing his ears, a memory of belonging that slipped through his grasp. He turned away, his steps slow, and entered the woods, the shadows folding around him like a cloak. The trees whispered in the breeze, their branches swaying gently, and he felt a peace settle over him, a quiet born not of home but of release. He built a small shelter there, its walls of fallen logs, its roof a weave of branches. The river's murmur became his companion, the rustle of leaves his lullaby. He hunted alone, his axe a tool now, not a weapon, its blade slicing through wood and hide. He carved a bench by the water, his hands steady, the work a balm to the restlessness within. The village lay close, its lights a faint glow through the trees, but he did not return. He watched from afar, a guardian of a life he could no longer claim. The seasons turned, the snow blanketing the forest in silence, the spring awakening it with birdsong. The raider grew older, his hair whitening, his frame softening, but his eyes remained clear, fixed on a horizon only he could see. He found a new life in the quiet, in the rhythm of the river, the weight of an axe turned to purpose, the solitude that fit him better than the village ever could. The sea wolves had sailed on without him, their longships cutting through distant waves, but he stayed, a man remade by the stillness of the shore. The seventh story. The Raven Banner. The longship drifted through the mist, its oars slicing the water with a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. The Viking chieftain stood at the prow, his broad hands resting on the rail, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon. His cloak, heavy with the dew of dawn, fluttered gently in the breeze, and his beard, thick and dark, caught the faint light of a rising sun. Beside him, lashed to the mast, hung the Raven Banner, a triangle of black cloth, its edges frayed, its center embroidered with a single raven, wings spread wide. The threads shimmered faintly as if woven with secrets older than the sea itself. The warband sat in quiet readiness, their shields stacked along the deck, their axes gleaming in the soft glow. They sailed toward a distant shore, a fortress said to guard riches beyond measure, gold, silver, a legacy to carve their names into the sagas. The chieftain had led them to countless victories, his banner raised high in each battle, its shadow a promise of triumph. But the cost lingered in his mind, a weight heavier than the steel at his side. Each time the raven flew, someone dear to him fell, a brother, a friend, a child claimed by a fate he could not outrun. The sea stretched vast and tranquil, its waves lapping against the hull, a soothing murmur that cradled the ship as it glided onward. The chieftain's thoughts drifted back through the years, carried on the wind like leaves on a stream. He remembered the first time he had raised the banner, a raid on a coastal village under a sky streaked with fire. The enemy had fallen like wheat before a scythe, their cries swallowed by the tide, and victory had been his. But that night, his younger brother had slipped from the ship, the waves taking him without a sound, his laughter silenced forever. Another memory surfaced, a battle in a snow-dusted valley, the banner snapping in the wind as steel clashed and blood stained the frost. The foe had broken, their shields splintered, their fortress is to claim. Yet as the fires burned low, his closest friend, a man who had fought at his side since boyhood, collapsed by the hearth, his breath fading, his hand still clutching a horn of mead. The chieftain had buried him under the pines, the raven's shadow a mark he could not erase. The shore emerged from the mist, a jagged line of cliffs crowned by the fortress, its walls rising like the spine of some ancient beast. The warband stirred, their hands tightening on their weapons, their faces set with resolve. The chieftain turned to the banner, its black cloth swaying gently, the raven's eyes stitched in silver thread seeming to watch him. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the fabric, and felt a chill seep into his bones, a whisper of the cost yet to come. His wife waited at home, her hair golden as the fields, her smile a warmth he carried through the cold. His son, barely grown, stood among the warriors now, his shield unscarred, his spirit bright. The longship scraped against the rocky beach, and the warband leapt ashore, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The chieftain led them up the winding path, the banner still furled, its weight a burden he bore alone. The fortress loomed above, its gates barred, its towers bristling with spears. The air carried the scent of salt and stone, and a faint breeze rustled the trees that clung to the cliffs. The warriors fanned out, their shadows stretching long in the pale light, their steps steady as they prepared for the greatest raid of their lives. The chieftain paused, his hand hovering over the banner's lashings. Victory lay within reach, the fortress's wealth, the glory of a triumph none could rival. He pictured the gold piled high, the sagas sung in his name, the raven banner flying over a conquered land. But the cost lingered, a shadow at the edge of his vision. He saw his wife's face, her eyes soft with love, her hands weaving by the fire. He saw his son, strong and eager, his laughter echoing across the deck. The raven's price was clear, one of them would fall, their life snuffed out to feed the banner's power. The fortress gates shuddered under the first assault, the warband's axes biting into the wood, their shields raised against a rain of arrows. The chieftain stood apart, the banner clutched in his hands, its cloth cool against his skin. The battle unfolded like a dance, the clash of steel a distant song, the cries of the fallen swallowed by the wind. He watched his son charge forward, his shield gleaming, his movements swift and sure. The boy fought like a wolf, his spirit unbroken, and the chieftain's chest tightened, a quiet pride warring with dread. The gates splintered, the warband surging through, their blades flashing in the torchlight. The fortress's defenders fell back, their lines crumbling, but the fight was fierce, the cost already mounting. A warrior dropped beside the chieftain, an arrow piercing his chest, his breath fading in the dirt. Another stumbled, his shield shattered, his body claimed by a spear. The chieftain's hand trembled, the banner still furled, its power untapped. Victory teetered on the edge, the raid's success hanging in the balance. He climbed a rise, the battle sprawling below, the fortress's towers wreathed in smoke. The raven banner swayed in his grasp, its threads catching the light, its promise a whisper in his mind. He could raise it now, call forth its magic, ensure the triumph that would echo through time. But the faces of those he loved swam before him, his wife's gentle touch, his son's bright gaze, the warmth of a home he might never see again. The cost loomed larger than the glory, a shadow he could no longer bear. The warband fought on, their strength waning, the fortress's heart still unconquered. The chieftain's son emerged from the fray, his shield notched, his face streaked with soot but alive. The chieftain's breath caught, his decision hardening like ice over a river. He turned from the battle, his steps slow, and walked to the cliff's edge, the sea stretching vast and serene below. The banner hung heavy in his hands, its raven staring up at him, unblinking, expectant. With a steady motion he cast it over the edge. The black cloth fluttered, spiraling down like a wounded bird, its silver threads glinting one last time before the waves swallowed it whole. The air grew still, the hum of its power fading, the weight lifting from his shoulders. He turned back to the battle, his axe raised, his choice made. Victory was no longer certain, but the cost was his to refuse, a price too dear for glory's fleeting shine. The warband faltered, the fortress holding firm, its walls unbreached. The chieftain joined them, his blade swinging with a quiet resolve, his son at his side. The raid ended in retreat, the longship sailing away empty-handed, its hull rocking gently on the tide. The warriors sat in silence, their faces weary, their shields scarred. The chieftain stood at the helm, the sea's whisper filling his ears, the horizon a promise of home. The raven banner was gone, its curse lost to the depths, and with it, the certainty of triumph. But as the ship sailed on, the chieftain felt a peace settle over him, a calm born of sacrifice, of a life spared, of a love unbroken. The sea stretched endless before them, its rhythm a lullaby, and he closed his eyes, the wind brushing his face, carrying him toward a shore where glory mattered less than the warmth waiting there. The eighth story. The last ship. The fleet sailed under a sky heavy with the promise of winter, its sails taut against a brisk wind that carried the scent of frost and salt. 5 longships cut through the waves, their prows carved with dragons' heads, their oars dipping in unison like the heartbeat of the sea. The Vikings aboard were seasoned raiders, their hands calloused from years of war, their eyes fixed on the horizon. This was their final raid before the snows locked them to their fjords, a chance to claim a fortune from a distant coast, to fill their halls with gold and glory. The lead ship rocked gently, its timbers creaking as the waves lapped against its hull. The chieftain stood at the helm, his cloak billowing, his beard streaked with gray. His warriors sat in quiet readiness, their shields stacked along the deck, their axes resting at their sides. The sea stretched vast and shimmering, a mirror of the pale sky, and the fleet sailed on, the rhythm of the oars a soothing pulse that carried them toward their prize. The air grew colder, the sun dipping low, casting a golden sheen across the water. Then the storm descended, a shadow rolling over the sea like a cloak unfurled. The wind turned sharp, clawing at the sails, and the waves rose there. The storm raged through the night, a symphony of wind and thunder that tossed the last ship like a leaf on a river. The warriors clung to the ropes, their bodies braced against the fury, their faces carved from resolve. The sails tore free, spiraling into the void, and the mast groaned under the strain. When dawn broke, pale and weary, the storm retreated, leaving the sea still and silent. The chieftain scanned the horizon, his chest heavy, the fleet was gone, the waves empty save for drifting wreckage and the lone ship that remained. The survivors took stock, their hands moving slowly, bailing water with helmets, securing what little gear survived. The ship drifted, its hull scarred but unbroken, carried by a gentle current under a sky now streaked with soft grays and blues. The chieftain counted his men, half the warband remained, their shoulders slumped, their breaths visible in the cold air. The sea cradled them, its surface smoothing into a glassy calm, and the ship sailed on, a solitary speck in an endless expanse. Land emerged from the mist, a rugged island ringed by cliffs and crowned with twisted pines. The chieftain guided the ship toward it, the keel scraping against a sandy shore fringed with pebbles. The warriors disembarked, their boots sinking into the damp earth, their steps weary but steady. The air carried the scent of seaweed and resin, and a faint breeze rustled the trees, a whisper of refuge in the stillness. The ship rested behind them, tilted slightly, its prow a silent guardian watching the waves. The island stretched before them, its cliffs rising sharp against the sky, its valleys cloaked in moss and shadow. The warriors spread out, their hands tracing the land, searching for a way to mend their fortunes. They found a stream winding through the rocks, its water clear and cold, and knelt to drink, the sound of its flow a balm to their exhaustion. Driftwood littered the shore, carried by the storm, and they gathered it, their movements slow, piling it beside the ship like an offering to the sea. The chieftain climbed a rise, his gaze sweeping the island, the ship a dark shape against the sand below. The hull was intact, but the oars were lost, the sails shredded, the mast weakened. He turned to the trees, their branches sturdy and tall, and felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The warriors followed, their axes biting into the wood, the steady rhythm of their strikes echoing through the stillness. The forest gave willingly, its pines falling one by one, their trunks dragged to the shore under a sky softening with dusk. Days blended into nights, the island a world of its own, cradled by the sea's endless embrace. The warriors carved new oars, their hands shaping the wood with care, the shavings curling like feathers at their feet. They wove nets from vines, casting them into the shallows, pulling fish that gleamed silver in the firelight. The chieftain worked beside them, his axe a tool now, splitting logs to brace the mast, his shoulders bending to a task gentler than war. The ship took shape again, its wounds patched, its spirit rekindled by the island's gifts. The sea watched, its waves lapping at the shore, a rhythm that lulled them as they rested by the fire each night. The stars emerged, bright and unyielding, a map above that promised home. The warriors slept under cloaks, their breaths mingling with the wind, their faces softened by the calm. The chieftain sat apart, his eyes tracing the horizon, the weight of the lost fleet a shadow that faded with each passing day. The island held them, its cliffs a shelter, its silence a peace they had not sought but found. When the ship was ready, its oars lined along the deck, its mast braced with fresh timber, the warriors gathered by the shore. The chieftain stood at the prow, his hand resting on the dragon's head, its carved eyes staring into the mist. They pushed the ship into the water, its hull sliding smoothly, the waves welcoming it back. The warriors climbed aboard, their movements steady, their shields stowed, their hands taking up the oars. The sea stretched before them, vast and serene, its surface a mirror of the sky's pale dawn. The island receded, its cliffs fading into the haze, its pines a memory against the horizon. The ship sailed on, the oars dipping in unison, their rhythm a quiet song that carried them forward. The chieftain stood at the helm, the wind brushing his face, the cold seeping into his bones but warming his spirit. The raid was lost, the fortune unclaimed, but the ship endured, a survivor of storm and sea, a vessel of homeward hope. The waves rocked them gently, the sky deepening to gold and violet, and the warriors rode on, their strength reborn in the stillness. The chieftain closed his eyes, the sea's whisper filling his ears, the island a fleeting dream behind them. Winter waited, its snows ready to cloak their fjords, but the last ship sailed steady, its course set, its heart unbroken. The sea stretched endless, a cradle of calm, and they drifted toward home, carried by the tide's gentle hand. The ninth story. The Captive's Revenge. The longship glided into the fjord under a sky painted with the soft hues of twilight, its sails fluttering gently in the evening breeze. The Vikings aboard stood tall, their cloaks streaked with salt and blood, their shields notched from battle. The raid had been a triumph, villages burned, spoils claimed, captives bound in the hold. The shore came into view, a crescent of pebbles framed by cliffs, and beyond it, their village glowed with the promise of welcome. Torches flickered along the path, their light dancing on the water, a beacon for the weary raiders. The ship scraped against the beach and the warriors leapt ashore, their boots crunching on the stones, their hands laden with sacks of silver and trinkets of gold. The village stirred to life, its people spilling from their homes, women with braided hair, children with wide eyes, elders leaning on staffs. The air filled with the scent of roasting meat and pine smoke, the hearths blazing as the feast began. The raiders strode through the streets, their shadows stretching long, their faces alight with pride. The captives followed, heads bowed, wrists tied, their steps slow under the weight of defeat. Among them walked a figure cloaked in rags, his frame lean, his hair matted with dirt. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, flickered beneath a lowered brow, taking in the village, the longhouse at its heart, the stables by the river, the forge glowing red in the dusk. The Vikings saw only a broken soul, another spoil of war, and led him with the others to a pen near the edge of the settlement. The gate closed behind them, the wood creaking softly, and the celebration swelled, the night alive with the clatter of horns and the rhythm of drums. The feast unfolded under a sky thick with stars. The villagers gathered around a great fire that cast a warm glow over their faces. The raiders sat on benches, their hands tearing into bread and meat, their laughter swallowed by the wind. The captives huddled in their enclosure, the cold seeping through their thin garments, the sounds of revelry a distant hum. The disguised warrior sat apart, his back against the fence, his fingers tracing the knots of his bonds. The rope was rough, but his touch was patient, steady, unraveling the threads as the moon climbed higher. The village settled into a contented hush, the fire dwindling to embers, the warriors slumping into sleep, their bodies heavy with mead and exhaustion. The night grew still, the air cool and crisp, the river's murmur a gentle lullaby weaving through the silence. The captive worked on, his hands freed at last, the rope falling silently to the ground. He rose, his movements fluid, a shadow among shadows, and slipped through a gap in the fence, the wood yielding to his quiet strength. He crept toward the stables, the horses stirring faintly as he passed, their breath warm in the dark. A torch rested in a bracket by the door, its flame low but alive, and he lifted it, the light flickering across his face, a mask of resolve untouched by fear. He moved through the village, his steps soft on the packed earth, the torch a glowing ember in his grasp. The first house he reached was small, its thatch dry from the autumn sun, and he pressed the flame to its edge, watching as the fire caught, slow and steady, a whisper of destruction in the night. The blaze spread, its tendrils licking at the roofs, the smoke curling into the sky like a rising tide. The warrior moved on, his torch igniting stables, sheds, the longhouse itself, the flames growing bolder with each touch. The village awoke in chaos, the firelight painting the streets in hues of gold and crimson, the shadows dancing as the raiders stumbled from their beds. The captive turned, his work done, and slipped toward the river, its banks cloaked in mist, its current a path to freedom. The village burned behind him, the crackle of timber and the roar of flames a symphony that drowned the night. The raiders rallied, their axes raised, their faces twisted with rage, but the fire was their foe now, its hunger unstoppable. The stables collapsed, the horses bolting into the dark, their hooves a fading thunder. The longhouse groaned, its roof caving in a shower of sparks, the spoils of their raid consumed by the blaze. The warrior reached the river, his torch cast aside, its light snuffed out in the water's embrace. He waded into the shallows, the cold biting at his legs, the current tugging him downstream. The village receded, its glow a distant wound against the cliffs, its people lost to the chaos he had sown. He moved with the river, his body buoyed by its flow, the mist folding around him like a cloak. The night stretched vast and quiet, the stars peering through the haze, their light a guide as he drifted toward the sea. The river widened, its banks giving way to a rocky shore where the waves lapped gently, a rhythm as old as the tides. The warrior emerged, his rags clinging to his skin, his breath steady in the cool air. A small boat rested among the reeds, left by some fishermen, its hull weathered but sound. He pushed it into the water, its keel slicing through the surf, and climbed aboard, his hands taking up the oars. The sea stretched before him, endless and serene, its surface a mirror of the sky's deep indigo. The village burned on, its light fading as the warrior rowed, the oars dipping in a slow, soothing cadence. The flames had taken his revenge, the raiders' triumph turned to ash, their victory stolen by the captive they had overlooked. He leaned into the motion, the boat rocking gently, the sea's whispers filling his ears. The cliffs of home lay somewhere beyond the horizon, a promise carried on the tide, and he sailed toward it, a shadow adrift in the calm. The stars watched, their glow softening the night, and the warrior rode on, his strength unbroken, his spirit lightened by the weight of retribution lifted. The sea cradled him, its waves a lullaby, its vastness a refuge from the fire he had left behind. The village was a memory now, a scar on the shore, and he drifted free, carried by the current's gentle hand, a lone figure vanishing into the stillness of the dawn.